All right, welcome to another edition of New Wine Uncorked. This episode again, I'm Matt Farlow, that's Tony Wynn, and that's Phil Berlin down below us. And we're stepping into the truth of the church. In today's culture, we have a lot of it, just like it has been in the generations, right? In the seasons before us, the church is always pressed into cultural issues. And right now we have racism, COVID-19, violence. They all cry out for the church's attention. And so the question is how does the church proceed? Like, what is it that the church's response to such things like COVID-19 with the worship, across the nation? How is it that the church focuses on these? Should these three be the focus of the church? Or is the church missing out on its focus of who we're supposed to be pursuing and how to do so? And so today, in this episode, just stepping into this, and I'm trying to, my thoughts, Tony's thoughts and Phil's thoughts of where we're at. And for those of you who are watching, please feel free to make comments below in the comment section. And make sure that you subscribe, because each week when we're doing this, a way to interact is through the comments. And then you could subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, as well as then head on over to Facebook and look up New Wine Skins. And on our Facebook page, these videos will be posted as well. And that's yet another way for you to interact with us, so that we can then step in together, like John 17 says, this communal understanding, so as to be unified in one. So guys, I'm just wondering today, with these focuses, COVID-19, racism, violence, what is the church's role in today's culture? And are we doing it correctly? Are we pushing into today's culture and happenings? And is this what the church should be focusing on? Are we doing it effectively and faithfully? Either one. Like, that's just a general question. So I don't know, Phil, what are your thoughts on it?
I was up there for a second. Hey, well, first off, I am looking at those aspects. Those are things that I feel that, in many regards, much of the church is focusing on right now, just as a reaction to all the things going on and just in our present society. Many of you guys know, Portland, Oregon, we actually had a shooting that happened in the middle of protests, the demonstrations that was going on, and I mean, ironically, it wasn't like the Black Lives Matter protest. Wasn't any of those folks, and it's just ironic that those folks have been meeting for several months without anything along those lines that ended up happening over the past week. So yeah, it's been pretty ironic though, that this has been much of the talk that Christians have been having, and I don't think any of these should be the focus. Maybe things that Christians should be addressing, but not necessarily like a focus of where the church should be.
Yeah, I think for the American church, the American church is not adequately and properly addressing issues of racism, especially white American churches. But I think that's also due to the fact that white American Christianity is intertwined with racism and slavery. Often we'll hear public theologians and authors like Jim Wallace say racism is America's original sin. If that's the case, then racism and slavery is also the liturgy of American Christianity. There's a lot of revisionist historical work out there, but a thesis that's being pushed forward lately is that a part of the Revolutionary War was to maintain slavery within the colonies, because slave emancipation was already taking place or burgeoning in Great Britain. And so a part of maintaining independence and sovereignty and representation wasn't just taxation, but it was also the right to have slaves. I think also looking at the doctrinal and theological developments and the ecclesial developments of the white American church, we can see how it is married to slavery and racism. I mean, the Southern Baptist, the largest denomination in the United States, became Southern Baptists because of slavery. Their seminaries are monuments to white slave owners. And so when we talk about if the American church is properly addressing it, slavery and racism, I would say no, it isn't. But I think it's because it's functioning exactly the way it was built to function as a system and a structure. And sure, that may feel really like heavy and weighty for some people to hear. For me, that isn't necessarily a ecclesial statement. That's more of a sociological and anthropological statement. That's tracing a historical development of what people have believed and still believed, and trying to follow the train tracks for that. And so the theological argumentation for that is another conversation in itself. But I think we can trace, just through empirical data, looking at the writings of Christians from the Puritans all the way down to today, you can trace there is forensic data as to the support for systemic oppression and racism. Sure, some people may say, "Oh man, that's hokey. That's a conspiracy theory." I would say, in turn, let's walk through the data together. If we're always talking about being rational, being logical, let's remove our emotions. Let's look at the forensic data together. So that's my hot take.
Yeah, and I'm sure, like you were saying, you're gonna get some pushback, right? Someone would say, with my skin tone, "Oh, of course, Tony, you're gonna bring up the racial thing, and of course, Matt, you get on there because you got white guilt, and of course, Phil, you get on there and huff and puff about the racial thing because you're trying to benefit yourself." And yet, like you were just saying, Tony, right? It's a reality that we have to each wrestle with. Just like when I teach the students at the school I'm at, you have to wrestle with your choice to have sex outside of marriage. If you sit down and get married, you have to account for what you've done before, And so I feel like, I think you talked about, well, maybe it was not this last one. We just, the latest episode of Uncorked goes into religious liberty and talks about that. And maybe it was the one before that with the homo consumus and the consumption. But Tony, you brought up this idea of the spiritually transmitted disease, right? The STDs that we transmit to one another. So often I feel like, though, it's a transmitted disease of ignorance, but I don't think that the white evangelical can claim ignorance because we know what's in front of us, right? And so I totally agree. And it's how then does the church account for the need to step into racial reconciliation while also ministering to folks that are dying or getting sick from COVID-19? Right there, like you were saying, Phil, yesterday or the day before with the shooting. And wasn't it a shooting between someone who was there as a protester for the one side, shot by another protester from the other side? Wasn't that the case, I thought?
That really, if I'm understanding the news reports correctly, that really wasn't even the case. It's kind of like these guys were kind of a part of the same side of, because there was the pro-Trump kind of crew that was in regard, and that's where that argument and the shooting took place, if I'm not mistaken. But that's, which is, and again, like I said, that was so strange because we have Black Lives Matter protest guys that's been down there since March, and since the beginning of all this stuff, since George Floyd was murdered, and yeah, we have not had anything quite like that happen this entire time, and yeah. But I do have a question though, Tony. Just in response to what you commented on earlier, just what is the appropriate, the church's appropriate way of talking about racism and slavery within the church? What do you think there? What's an appropriate way for the church to be talking about this?
I think if it's the American church and the white American church in particular, it's starting by listening to Black pastors and Black leaders, and also listening to leaders of color. I think the Black community and the Hispanic community and the Asian community has modeled what it looks like to have a political theology. And so for all the talk of like, wow, evangelicalism doesn't have a political theology, but it does. For all the talk of we don't want to be political, that in and of itself is a political theology, whether it's abdication or passivity, that is a political ideology and theology. I think the Black church has consistently modeled civic responsibility and theological faithfulness. I think the Hispanic community and the Asian community has faithfully modeled what it means to stay Christian and pursue the kingdom of heaven here on earth while also being civically minded. And so, yeah, I think for the white American church, the evangelical American church, it begins to listen. And so a plug that I would love to give is Pastor Bradley Mason out of Epiphany Fellowship out in Philadelphia recently gave a sermon on a theological case for reparations. It's in the sermon series called Canceled. I would encourage everybody to go listen to it, because regardless of whether or not you agree with the ethical and moral case for reparations, Pastor Mason makes a darn strong theological case for reparations, and then begin the conversation from there. But I think, yes, it begins with those who have always spoken being willing to now take the back seat and listen, and then go from there. But for me, there are churches already doing the work of racial reconciliation. They're just not on the platform or prominent, and they're not white. They have nothing to lose, so they're going to pursue the hardest thing possible as the beloved community. But when you're talking about a church with affluence and position and posture and status, man, there's no better way to kill attendance than to talk about race, because race is political, and then the implications ensue. So that's just my young millennial take, hot take number 2.
So hold on, let's dive into that a little bit more, because in the middle of, we're having this conversation on COVID and breaking the law and people getting together and the like. My church is going to start meeting in 2 weeks here, but then we have churches that are turning towards talking about justice, talking about race, and as you said, Tony, that's like the easiest way to drop your attendance, really, right? So I am wondering, though, is the turn that we are seeing among white evangelicals and predominantly white churches turning towards talking about justice and talking about race, does it kind of seem like an overcorrection? That they're it's not just that they're bringing it up, but the manner in which they're kind of accepting everything that's going on with Black Lives Matter and not really necessarily critiquing much of it. Is it kind of like an overcorrection, or they're just turning in that direction altogether? So,
yeah, I think. Yeah, I
go
think
ahead, Tony.
it's just the way that evangelicalism and American Christianity functions, because it's so nimble and in the way that it adapts to the cultural climate in order for it to stay relevant, because it has no theological underpinnings, or it doesn't have deep theological roots. Evangelicalism and American Christianity more so has a huge megastructure, but very little substructures. And so it's very young as a theological movement. Faith within the United States is very young because we're a very young nation. And so I think I wouldn't say it's an overcorrection on the side of evangelical pastors or white Christians. I would say it's actually them fulfilling out their missional thrust because they're so nimble and flexible. I mean, we only need to look back 2 years. Like, if you were an evangelical pastor and you said Black Lives Matter 2 years ago, you would be an anathema. You would be just outcasted and defrocked in Protestant terms. But just this year, you have J.D. Greear, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, coming out and saying Black Lives Matter. You have these prosperity gospel preachers who have Instagram followings larger than the Pope come out and say Black Lives Matter. And they can say it without any social recourse because it's hip. In order for their brand of evangelicalism to stay relevant, it makes sense for them to say it. But I mean, we can trace it like 10 years ago when the multi-ethnic, multicultural church was a huge movement. Like, that was just white evangelicals saying, man, we need to stay relevant. But in reality, it was just another like integration, like colored people coming to a white church and we're all getting our green cards. Like, it just, there wasn't any substantive work being done. We see the sociological trends, but we don't see any theological development or conviction. And so, yeah, I'm with you, Phil. I don't think that it's an overcorrection. I think we're still missing the red herring, and maybe it's because the people who have always started the conversation continue to dominate the conversation. Because white Christians still need to learn how to talk about race, and while they're still learning how to talk about race, Black brothers and sisters are getting murdered. Colored people are getting lynched before our very eyes. And we still have to say, man, let's teach our white brothers and sisters how to have the conversation or create a safe space. What safe space? Like, if it's dangerous being a Black person, what safe space is there? And so that's just my angst that I'm feeling like, man, I'm all for unity. I'm all for building a bridge. But when we build a bridge, who gets to cross that bridge? And which way does traffic flow? Yeah.
And yeah, who's the first across the bridge, right? Because a lot of times in military, the people who go first are usually expendable, right? In the sense, so I agree with you. Like, building the bridge, it would be very of the time to say, "Ooh, we're building the bridge, and then we're going to allow our Black and brown brothers and sisters to go in front of us," right? Well, you put to, and this is where the joke in sometimes in the military would be, you have the Marines out front because they're the front line, and what happens to the front line? They take the initial bullets, right? And so again, building the bridges would recognize, though, but you don't put them out there on their own to be massacred by the social media. However, my pushback would be, is that what I see with the commandeering of this, so the Black Lives protests, I think, are absolutely necessary. My concern is when white people step in and then they almost culturally appropriate the irritation, the anger, the hatred that has come about through the centuries from the enslavement of people, whether it's the indigenous and taking of the lands, whether it's for Hawaiians and they were removed from their place, and same thing within the Black culture, whether it's the Mexican, Hispanic down in the borders. My concern is when you get these white evangelical pastors and all of a sudden they're up there pontificating as if, and it's a misappropriation, right? Appropriation means that you are appropriately using the culture that you are then trying to step in and understand it. Cultural appropriations today have become pejorative because predominant culture, i.e. the white culture, has taken these other cultures and attempted to make it their own. I saw a video the other day in Portland of these group of Black Lives Matter protesters. They had on the shirts. They were all white, and they were surrounding this woman on a bench, and they were yelling at her, who was also white. She was there to protest, but she was stopping and she was eating, and they were just berating her. And my problem is same thing with the other side, though. The 17-year-old who came over from Illinois into Wisconsin, I feel like he was culturally appropriating this protest mentality. And what did he do? He took a gun. And in fact, the second kid that he killed was a white guy. on a skateboard who was running. And again, that kid was misunderstanding, I think, the protest, which he took it upon himself to be angry with another person coming in with a gun and disrupting the protest. That's great, but we have to be careful that the whites don't step in and then like whether they know it or not, they become still the same figure, this white messianic figure that they think they're trying to get rid of, right? Because they step in and they say, "Ooh, we're gonna lead the dialogues, we're gonna build the bridge, and we're gonna then send them over in front," as opposed to saying, "Dudes," like John Perkins said, "That's fine. You can give us all the fish we want and feed us for these days, but once they run out, if you've never taught us how to cultivate the pond, we're never going to be able to be the fullness of our own creation," right? And so I think there's a real tension here of these white pastors. If you bring in a black pastor and say we're going to hire him or her simply to be diverse, that's not doing the racial reconciliation. Because if you go back in the early or late 1990s with this book called Purpose Driven Church and you read it, Warren even claims that a diverse church is going to be spiritually special because not all pastors can have a diverse. And I'm like, the reason why is because you have too many people of this white mentality that have never been indoctrinated into the fullness of pure racial reconciliation, right? And so I think that there's this tension there of stepping back and going, hey, racial diversity isn't always it should not be led primarily by one race, but it's got to be a collection. However, like you were saying, Tony, the white evangelical pastors in white in the church has to step back and go, holy crap, dude, I need to be learning and dialoguing with my brown and black brothers and sisters and going, I just didn't see it because I have a very white mentality. Systemic evil happens because over the years, the people that we educate in our culture are educated within the same educational system and not breaking through to the systemic evils of that educational system. So you raise up teachers teaching about racial reconciliation in 2020, that's great. But if they've not gone back to 1600s and 1400s and seen how this systemic evil has been even indoctrinated within our own culture, even with the reformers, there was still a slave mentality involved. So I think the fullness of it needs to continue to happen to where, yeah, the white people in the church, when they hear about it this Sunday again, we got to get to a point where they go, oh, I'm starting to understand, as opposed to where they're at now, where they're like, really, again, we're going to talk about racial. However, I'm also concerned that racial reconciliation is not the only topic or issue of the church today. If you go back and look what happened in Memphis before Dr. King was shot, he was on his way to Washington. He stopped to deal with the sanitation workers, right? And the lack of equity when it came to money. So while I agree with you, Tony, one way to hit up the numbers and to watch them decrease in a white church is to talk about race. But I think an equally, if not more, within all churches, I've said this before, is start talking about where their money is. You get those two heavy weights of economics and race, and that's a way to kill the church, especially the white evangelical church, right? Don't tell me what to do with my money. I give my 10%, and stop telling me that I'm racist because, hey, dude, I've got a black friend. Let me show you, here's the text, right? We text 3 times a year. Okay. He's my friend, we're a racially diverse church because every third Sunday I bring in my black brother and we give him a stipend. We help him out. It's like, that's not racial reconciliation. So I agree with you. I think there's just some complexity that we have to step into the dialogue together and go, oh man, I messed up. I didn't know what I was saying that was so offensive. But we have to be dialoguing so that you can help me see from your perspective. And then also I can help you see from my perspective. The Harper Lee, Atticus Finch to Scout Finch. The way in which you understand a person is to walk in their skin, So I think it's something we have to continue to deal with, right? Continue to interact with.
Yeah, definitely something I think that, we have a little platform here. That's something we should be talking about a little bit more as well. And another thing I'm thinking about in relationships with this is just the notion that I could just imagine as a pastor with this being dropped on my lap, never once relating race in the gospel and relating justice in the gospel, because I had not talked about it at all through seminary. None of my professors talk about it this particular way. And now I have talked about it on Sunday and then next Sunday. And now people are frustrated with me, and I still feel a burden to have to talk about it. And I could just imagine how scary that would be, and how intimidating, and how I really wouldn't be incentivized to talk about this anymore at all. I could see myself just simply just jumping out of the conversation, not trying to do it. So saying all that to say, Matt, I appreciate your passion in talking about this, and just figuring out how, in fact, the church should approach this issue becomes just as a serious thing, because we got to figure it out, because we have not talked about it. Now our crew has, because going to Multnomah and New Wineskins, that's a blatant plug there, that we got the opportunity to talk about this amongst one another at retreats and various things, but most of our theology classes weren't talking about this at all. So,
yeah. I mean, I think one of the barriers that prevents leaders and pastors from having this conversation and on teaching on race is we're such a punitive society. When you mess up, like, that's it. When you make a mistake, you're done. And so there is no room for grace. There is no room for mercy. There is no room for learning. And so when we don't create spaces for pastors to learn and to make mistakes, we only further ingrain them and ingratiate them into their own system. And I say that only because out of a desire to see more pastors tackle this issue. And so I think that's one reason why pastors don't talk about it, is because they don't want to say the wrong thing and then lose everything. But then I think the other side is too, they don't want to lose everything. They love, like, yes, pastors have a bad name, but man, you get that spiritual high, you get that power. It's a tough drug to kick. When you get to influence people because you have the authority of God behind you. I've never done drugs, but I mean, like, talk about feeling on cloud 9 and being such a finite person, and then you cloak it in like humility and reverence and the like, but you're just like this warped creature. You're like, oh man, I just need one more kick. And so you get on the pulpit, you'll say something controversial, but then you'll back it up and backpedal by saying something conciliatory. And dude, it's a trip. And so for some pastors, I don't think they want to talk about it because they love the current position they're in. And it's much easier to take a faithful Christian stand against homosexuality and abortion, but those are just red herrings. Like, it's controversial because you make it controversial. But the real issues we need to focus on, should it be controversial? And so, yeah, I think, and then when we talk about education in terms of systems and structures, I think it also goes back to seminaries. Yes, people go to seminary and they're not taught how to talk about race. And they're not taught how to handle finances. But maybe it's because it's not that the seminaries are failing, but seminaries are performing exactly the way they're built to perform. If we look at the history of seminaries, and this sounds like a conspiracy, but I'm telling you guys, just read a Wikipedia article and follow the links. Look at the footnotes in Wikipedia articles and go to those primary sources. It's there. It's public information. It's not like some dudes in a back room, like, huddled together over a table under a lamp, like, how are we going to rewrite and make revisionist history? Like, this is all here. It's well documented. And so the failure of pastors in their education, is also a product of seminaries. Like, I think, yeah, we are fortunate to go to Multnomah, but I can't tell you the amount of times people have accused Dr. Metzger of being like this, like, anarchist liberationist theologian that wants to like tear down the Orthodox faith. And I'm like, man, like just because he assigned James Cone, like there's nothing wrong with being a liberation theologian, but like, dude, we just read the cross and the lynching tree, and you're out here like ready to like call on the Vatican and say like Metzger's like, leading students astray. I'm like, dude, I lead myself astray. Don't give Metzger that credit. Like, I want to own that. And so we're blessed to be at Multnomah, but man, I think some seminaries are doing exactly what they were built to do, which is to make sure we focus our earthly lives on a heavenly trajectory. The kingdom of heaven is our home, and I'm just a pilgrim passing through. Man, we've been passing through for 300, 400 years. Let's give it a break.
Yeah, let me jump one more thing and then let you close this out, Matt. Although we have been blessed to, we had the opportunity to go to Multnomah, we had the opportunity to work with Metzger as we have, and had the opportunity to think through some of these things, but we really only scratched the surface on so much of it. Going through, only Black author I was assigned all the way through Multnomah was James Cone, and maybe some articles or some speeches from King, but that was maybe one of the only books, and maybe one other brown author, right? And so we only really scratched the surface. There's so many more things to kind of help us, that would have helped us kind of interact a little more and engage a little bit more on these topics that a lot of, I'm sure from our perspective, would call more liberal seminaries that are talking about these issues that are really just things that are on the streets that would really help us interact far more than we would have had the chance to. So, albeit, yeah, man, we were blessed, but there's still so much more to consider, and so much, and then have to give ourselves the grace to continue to learn in these fields. So,
I think, because I appreciate both of you have shown me, and just allowing there needs to be an allowance of all of us, right, to allow each one of us to be in this conversation, because I think there needs to be an honesty. I think any white male, for instance, that doesn't admit that there's a little fear. Like I'm afraid that, like, what if I continue to acknowledge my wrongdoing in the sense of, racial reconciliation wasn't foremost, and then stepping into these issues of, I want to elevate Black and brown. There, you have to wrestle with, deep inside me, there's a fear too of, well, if I do that, am I going to be washed out, to where I no longer exist? And I think once we wrestle with that, what Jung would say, that shadowed conscious, that the shadow person of mine, that I'm willing to go and step into those feelings, then I get just a glimpse of what you must have been feeling like throughout the years of being washed out and being put to the side, and that fear of never being able to speak into this situation right now. If I'm not willing to tangibly step into that discomfort of going, wow, if I go further in this and acknowledge my wrongdoing based on my ancestors, or the color of my skin that's always been in power, and yes, I could possibly lose my voice. If I don't wrestle with that, how can I ever even step into the ounce of understanding where you've been, and where men and women of color have been throughout the centuries, even going back to the first and second centuries, where we wash them out because of the color of their skin. And I think that the honesty with that, if I admit that, and not having then you, like last week you said, Tony, you don't want to be seen as slam dunking on the white pastor. And so if I admit that, hey, I'm afraid that I do have an addiction to power, right? But I'm afraid that if I start speaking out, then I might lose some of my voice, because you're going to come in and say, yeah, you're a piece of crap. See what you're doing. You're finally admitting it. I think your willingness to say, hey, look, I don't want to be Duncan, and having grace with someone who is admitting it will allow us to speak into it even more. The last thing you do to someone who admits their sin is to say, oh, see, finally, you recognize you're a piece of crap. No, you go, oh, good. Now you're starting to see the fullness, right? Jesus didn't say that the woman at the well wasn't caught in sin. He embraced her, and then turned to the dudes who were trying to persecute her And he didn't then call them pieces of crap. What did he do? He gently knelt down and started to write in the sand and help them realize they're no different than this woman. I'm no different in the sense that if someone took me and collected a bunch of dudes who looked like me up and said, now you're going to be stuck in the warehouse in the shed out back for the next 20 years, I have to go, oh, I wouldn't like that. Well, that's just a small glimpse, a small analogy of what was done for 400 years and then some, not to just Black people, but also to Native Americans. You know, here in our culture, the Hawaiians were displaced from their own land. You talk about then, Tony, you want to talk about controversy when we get into gay marriage. What if we say that the gays within each of our own races have been oppressed? You know, we start to get into some of these issues of, oh, what have we done to the disabled if they can't speak properly, right? They have a stuttering, uh, um, uh, where they stutter, and we make fun of them, you know, or we don't, but we in sarcasm. You know, what about the singles? You know, like if we're not willing to deal with issues like that, where we sort of, oh, if you're single in the evangelical church, there's something wrong with you as a single 50-year-old. Oh, you know, and if you're a male, we look at subtly judging them and saying probably some sort of sexual deviant. You know, if we can't deal with what's right here in front of us, the thing that's in front of us right now is this racial tension. It is the racial reconciliation. And amidst that, talk about COVID-19 and say all lives matter, but then go in and look at who is disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Black and brown, poor. Again, go to look at Dr. Martin Luther King. The three issues that he dealt with: poverty, militarism, and racism. So fine, be a church that wants to be racially woke. Start dealing with those three issues, you know, and talking to it. And then you start to realize it makes people uncomfortable, you know. But I think it has to happen where people see, hey, these dudes are doing it. How are they doing it? And then we continue to, you know, to imitate that. Ways in which the pastor from Philadelphia, Mason, right? That's his last name, right? And which, by the way, for those you watching, go right below here, and the link for that sermon is going to be on here, because what racial reconciliation can do is when you know of good things, such as great speeches from Dr. King, great sermons from Pastor Mason, we have to continue to share. I have to be willing to stop talking to hear what you've gone through, right? But it's not a competition. I don't need you, Phil, to give me times where you've been the victim of racism to know that racism exists. You tell me it exists, and if I love you as a brother, your word should be gold to me. I'm so tired of these white people's questions saying, like, we're doing this through the church here that I'm at, and the question always starts out as, well, what situations of racism have you experienced? I'm like, who gives a crap? If you're telling me there's racism, I believe you, right? Not that I don't see it myself, but I've never been pulled over because of the color of my skin. But if you tell me, Phil, dude, it happens because I know you, and I'm like, there's no way Phil's dealt with this. There's no way, Tony. You guys are way too peaceful and loving and stuff. If you tell me that there's no way a cop would be mean to you, right? Or someone of white skin would be mean to you. You guys are, it's the thugs, and they generalize and I'm like, that's horseshit. Again, that's not. I don't need you to. For you to say this exists, that should be good enough for me. I feel like that's not, for some reason, and I don't know what, if you guys feel that. I'm sure you do. What's the way forward in that, right? Is to teach each other to trust one another, to really love. Next week, this is what we want to do, is to, how do we do that? How is racial reconciliation part of ecclesial reconciliation? Reconciling the church within so as to reconcile without. Be sure, for those of you that are watching, like Tony mentioned, we're going to have that link right down below in the description section. And then right next to Phil is that button that says subscribe. And on the other side of him is that button that says next video. This is to get you a part of New Wine, because yes, while we agree that Multnomah and New Wine are not perfect, the reality is we got exposed to things that we wouldn't have been exposed to had we gone to another seminary or been a part of another group. New Wine's the end all by any means, right? And Tony or Phil, who are leaders, myself, who are leaders at New Wine, easily will lead astray, just like Dr. Metzger's led us astray plenty of times, right? Because why? We're fallible creatures, but to do it together, then we get participation with beautiful people like Trudy, beautiful people like Jim, beautiful people like that are part of New Wine to help us all hear each other. That's done through New Wine UnCorked, New Wine tastings, New Wine table talks live on Facebook, which will be on Thursday, as well as this right here and the continued dialogue. So I totally appreciate it. And we're going to continue with this again next week and next episode. A New Wine UnCorked every Tuesday comes out with our new episode. Today was released with religious liberty. Great one that we had a great talk about last week in what does it mean to truly be free. And so we totally appreciate you joining us. In the comments below, if something's come up where you're like, oh, that's a great point, or what about this, write it and we will engage it, because that's what Tony and Phil and I are all about, is we want to engage this so as to make ourselves understanding more, faith-seeking understanding, to understand the other so as to understand one who created us, Jesus Christ. So on behalf of Tony, on behalf of Phil, you guys light me up, man. I love it, and I know that that's what everyone else is watching. We do this. This is iron sharpening iron, and we're asking you out there, our viewers, to sharpen our take on things as well by participating. So on behalf of Tony, on behalf of Phil, I'm Matt Farlow. This has been New Wine UnCorked. Until next time, we will see you on the flip side.